Never Caught: The Story of Ona Judd. Chapter 8: Surviving. In many ways, New York City in 1789 had the same definable characteristics it does today. It was a city so encompassing that within it was the best of everything and the worst of everything. Back then, this characteristic meant that it was hard to figure out what to trust, what to expect, what to value. Just like a young child learning a new language, the words, the meanings, the rules, the United States needed to learn the meanings and rules of a constitution that said everyone was born equal and deserving of the same rights, while upholding a system where some humans were definitely not equal and did not have the same rights. It was going to take a long time. Meanwhile, New York City, out of all the cities in the new country, was the most glaring example of what happened when a new country hadn't figured things out yet. It has rich residents like Governor Clinton, and the desperately poor, like some of the white servants coming to work for the Washingtons. It had the educated classes, people like Aaron Burr, the future vice president, who had graduated from Princeton, and Alexander Hamilton, the future Secretary of the Treasury and founder of the New York Post, who had graduated from King's College, now called Columbia University. And it had people even besides the enslaved who had gone to school not even for a day. It had abolitionists who were part of the New York Manumission Society. Manumission is what happens when a slave owner frees his slaves. But many of these abolitionists were, yes, slave owners. Escaped slaves hid in the busy city dark corners and alleyways, hopeful for a job where their identity would not be discovered. Free blacks worked many jobs and could not get which was not many. Social climbing rich white people owned slaves to make them feel more important and to benefit from their labor. Many free black men and women lived proudly and publicly, even forming their own clubs and organizations that fought for the reputation and credibility of the blacks who lived in New York City. Everything was in upheaval: the laws, the customs, even the location for the new federal government. Over the next 18 months, life as Ona knew it would be thrown up into the air and juggled. It would not settle into routine again for many, many months. On her first days in New York City, Martha Washington, 58 years old, went straight to a dinner. Ona would have dressed her and fixed her hair again, and made sure her shoes did not have any clumps of dirt on their heels and that her corset was suitably tight. She may have accompanied her owner to the dinner even though Ona, if not Martha, was probably exhausted. One of the many reasons why Martha was unable to engage in so many social activities, besides her innate energy, was Ona. Like a thermometer persistently set on calm, Ona was the constant mood regulator for Martha, who was allowed to act however she wanted, to be sad, to be angry, to snap at someone, to be cool and icy, to be exuberant. Ona was there to help Martha on whatever ruffled emotional ocean she was traveling. This was what differentiated Ona from someone like her sister-in-law, Charlotte, who could not stop herself from lashing out at the estate manager and at slavery in general. Ona's ability to not lose her cool, along with her intelligence and bravery, would become even more important to Martha in the days ahead. On June 1789, not even after a month after Martha arrived in New York City, a potential calamity struck. George Washington, at 57, became very sick. In some ways, it was strange that he hadn't gotten ill earlier. This was a world where the average lifespan was between 35 and 40 years old. George had been a soldier for most of his adult life. Difficult and often unclean conditions at war, as well as his advancing age, had taken her toll on George's body. When he came down with a fever in June, it didn't go away. Instead, it lasted, and with it a tumor grew in his left leg. Soon he was in such pain that he could not move. By June 17th, the well-respected New York doctor Samuel Bard had no choice but to operate on the president's leg. It was a nerve-wracking time for everyone inside the house, undoubtedly for those people aware of his sickness on the outside. The beginning of anything brings anxiety. The beginning of the United States was no different. George Washington was the president whom everyone seemed to want to be in charge, and for him to not survive would have been seen as a catastrophe. The household decided to keep his sickness a secret. This made a terrible situation even worse. The first president of the United States was seriously ill, and having it to keep up the pretense that he was healthy was difficult for everyone who lived with him, Ona included. Martha was already unhappy to be in New York. To be there with a sick husband triggered every one of her anxieties. Her resilience on Ona intensified Ona. Plunged into the foreign world of the North, would have no opportunity to do anything but wait on Martha, who was waiting on George. Throughout the next several months, it was unclear whether he would survive. At first the household had no idea what to do, yet life did go on. There were clothes to be sewn and hair to be combed, and grandchildren who needed activities and schooling. Food supplies needed to be obtained from the nearest market. Shoes had to be fixed. In New York, it was not easy as sending shoes to the shoemaker or going to the grist mill to get flour. All these kinds of supplies needed to be purchased and carried and sorted. The slaves and servants had to figure this out in the unfamiliar, confusing, busy hive of activity known as New York City, and as usual, they did. George survived because of a combination of good medical care, his natural good health, and most of all, sheer luck. Still, it took him a long time to recover, an entire fall and much of the winter. It wasn't until February 1790 that he was able to resume his presidential schedule. It's hard to imagine Ona's confusion during her first winter in the North. New York snowfalls can be brutally cold, even dangerous. She undoubtedly slipped onto the slick cobblestones, iced over by freezing rain. She certainly shivered when she found herself outside without a warm enough coat, and she questionably felt the cold wind through the window sashes of the bedroom she shared with Moll, way up to the attic on Cherry Street. Maybe she discovered that one of the good things about the house being so crowded was that it helped to warm things up during the winter. As George grew stronger, Martha resumed the whirlwind of New York life. Very few people besides Ona and George knew Martha's true feelings. She served and served well as the president's social partner, an ideal image of grace and respectability. Unlike George, who was not comfortable socializing with strangers, Martha would open the house on Cherry Street to her female friends and acquaintances at 7 o'clock in the evening, serving tea, coffee, lemonade, and ice cream. These evenings could go on until 10 o'clock. On Thursdays, as George continued to get better, he and Martha began to host formal dinners that had to include people from all walks of political life. Foreign ministers, senators, and congressmen, as well as cabinet members, were invited to dine, and it was Martha who had to keep the conversation moving and upbeat. Martha would have looked forward to the Washington social occasions as it would have given her a chance to be by herself. At Mount Vernon, she would have been able to escape at night to the quarters to be with her mother and her siblings. In New York, this was not an option. She was always surrounded by people. When George had finally recovered, the household moved to a bigger home nearby at 39 and 41st at Broadway. This house had views of the Hudson River, fine carpets, and beautiful furniture. Of course, the burden of moving, remember, this was before moving vans and dollies and U-Haul, fell on the slaves. It is hard to think about Ona, her full skirts tangling up her move, carrying heavy crates downstairs and upstairs. Once they were in the new house, Ona probably tried again to settle into a routine. In the morning, perhaps, escorting Nellie to Mrs. Graham's school on Madeline Lane, the same street where Thomas Jefferson lived. In the afternoon, sewing and cleaning Martha's dresses. At night, preparing Martha for whatever social events she had planned. Ona would have learned the streets of downtown Manhattan in this way, even coming to recognize some of the people who crossed her path. Perhaps there was a free black man who tipped his hat to her. Perhaps she walked by the African Free School for black children that had been created in the New York Manumission Society. This school ended up educating most of the black men who became well-known leaders during the 1800s. Men including Alexander Cromwell, Henry Highland Garnet, and James McCune Smith, among others. Ona still could not read or write, but she was observing, listening, and remembering exactly what students were supposed to be doing at all the New York schools. In June 1790, Ona may have picked up Nellie on Maiden Lane, very close to the time when a famous dinner took place at Thomas Jefferson House. This dinner was not only famous because of the people who were there, Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, but it was famous, indeed legendary, because of the consequences it had for the new country, the politicians representing the country, and the slaves who were not yet allowed to claim the country for themselves. Alexander Hamilton wanted the capital of the United States to remain in New York. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both from Virginia, wanted the capital to be on the Potomac River near Mount Vernon. Hamilton and Jefferson weren't fond of each other, but they also knew that they had to work together. Besides the location of the country's new capital, Hamilton's priority was the assumption of the state's debts by the new federal government. In other words, he wanted the federal government to pay the bills ranked up by the individual states during the Revolutionary War. Jefferson and Madison most Southern leaders did not want this to happen. because A, the southern states did not owe as much money as the northern states because of slavery, and B, they did not want to risk having the federal government grow more powerful than the states. Hamilton offered up a deal. The capital city would be on the Potomac if the federal government paid the debts. Jefferson and Madison said yes, and as a kicker, they agreed that Philadelphia would be the temporary capital of the United States for the 10 years it would take to build this new federal city on the Potomac. What did this have to do with Ona? Everything. She had just moved from Mount Vernon to New York. She'd moved from Cherry Street to Broadway, and the household had always been planning on going to Mount Vernon for the summer months. She would have to pack for that too. And now these founding fathers had thrown yet another wrench into her life. The only glimmer of hope for Ona was that she was going to return to Philadelphia, the place that offered many more opportunities to Black people than were offered in New York, or certainly in Virginia. George Washington agreed with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. He wanted the nation's capital to be on the Potomac. He would do anything to be closer to his beloved Mount Vernon, but before the Washingtons could go back for the summer, another medical scare occurred. After they moved to their home on Broadway, George again became sick. Influenza, the flu, had recently spread throughout the city. Perhaps because of his long illness during the previous year, George was susceptible to this virus, and by late April he was too diagnosed with the deadly flu. This time people found out, Pennsylvania's Congressman George Clymer wrote, "But this observed here with a great deal of anxiety that his general health seems to be declining." Hundreds of New Yorkers died, old and young. George Washington was not one of them. He lost much of his hearing, but he survived. The summer move back to Mount Vernon had been postponed. Now, finally, in August 1790, the Washingtons were able to leave New York for Virginia. Everyone from the president to Ona was eager to take a step back from this very tumultuous life in the city. In 1 year, Ona had experienced more change and upheaval than many people do in a lifetime. And she did it all as a young teenager, serving the most powerful couple in the country. While Ona returned to Mount Vernon and hugged her mother Betty, she would do so with the wiser eyes of someone who had seen much of what could not be easily explained. And when she moved to Philadelphia in the fall, she would be wiser still.